And maybe you don't want kids, you don't care if great-great-grandchild has Christmas on the farm anymore because you're like, whatever. Or maybe you do, I don't know. But that goes back to that, what are we actually gonna do? You'd see all the time people pass away and the family saying, well, now what do I do? I have this huge estate tax bill, or I have this, we have to sell that. If we would have taken a step back and laid out and thought, a number of years ago, a couple hundred acres wasn't a big deal.
I know, but now.
At $500 an acre.
Right.
Now, depending on where you're at, $20,000 an acre.
Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're gonna move from donut talk on to actual topics. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Craig Lemoyne. I am the Associate Clinical Professor of Financial Planning here in the Department of ACE and the College of ACES. And one of the things that we cover in our work is estate planning. And so I'm really excited today to be able to host the first of two estate planning webinar events with my friend and attorney and graduate student, a bit of everything, my buddy J.R. Glenn. So J.R., go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, Professor Lemoyne, thanks for having me today.
Thanks for coming.
Excited about the topic. Something that's near and dear to my heart as a farmer and also a grad student here at the U of I. So as you said, I've been practicing lawyer. I've been practicing for 13 years. I'm actually now the Regional Vice President and General Counsel for FBFM, which a lot of farmers, if you're tuned in today, you probably have heard of FBFM, Farm Business Farm Management. We're throughout the state of Illinois, and we help people become more successful in their farming operations by helping them basically become better managers. We produce a lot of data that's used for research here at the College of ACES and the Department of ACE, and we've had a long-standing connection with the University of Illinois, so for over 100 years. So excited to be part of College of ACES and part of FBFM, and excited to be here today.
Well, thanks for coming, and we appreciate it. So today kind of is our first of two series, and the theme is added up, and we're not just going to jump into the adjusted gross estate, though we will get there a little later. So I wanted to start our conversation today with a little bit of, when I think of estate planning from my lens, you kind of have what happens before someone passes and what happens after, right? You can kind of break it into those two pieces. And we were talking offline earlier about donuts and Mexican food, but specifically we were talking offline earlier about how there's a preference for the estate planning before someone passes away. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit, when you work with farmers, when you work in agriculture, that's probably magnified, right?
Of course.
Getting done ahead of time. You're going to share a little bit on that.
So to your point, right? There's two steps. There's the before and after. The after, if the before is done, the after is just, I shouldn't say it's pretty simple, but it's pretty straightforward. If the before is not done, the after can be a mess. So why do you do before? You do before for a number of reasons, right? You have goals and you want to make sure maybe you're trying to avoid estate taxes, or maybe you're trying to make sure that the right people keep the farm in the family, and that the generations have it a certain way that you would like for them to have it. So those are all things you have to think about before. So
I want to dig in a little bit on that. Walk me through, let's say that I own a farm or I own land or I aspire to. What sort of documents do I need to put together ahead of time, and who do I go to make that happen?
Well, so I'm gonna answer your question, but not answer your question.
That's good.
So as part of the before plan, I mean, there's really two key people.
Okay.
There's a lawyer and there's a financial planner, or somebody that knows your finances.
Okay.
And those two individuals are going to help you set out your goals, your estate plan on what you want to accomplish. And that's going to be different for everybody. So if it's my first piece of farm property I'm buying, maybe it's just an investment. I'm buying it. I'm going to try and get a certain return on my investment, and I don't care if my heirs sell it, and I'll be happy if they do, and then they can have the proceeds. For other people, the farm might be in the family for 150 or 200 years. So it's not a question of keeping the asset to flip the asset or getting the asset to flip it. It's to keep the asset in the family going forward. How to start is making sure you understand what those goals are, and then having those two individuals. Because the documents, so now kind of going more specific to your question, the documents that are created are documents that are going to make sure that plan is executed correctly. So maybe you just need a simple will. maybe you need a trust. Maybe you need a generation skipping trust. Maybe you need to start doing gifts while you're alive using the federal gift exemption level to start passing part of a farm on. And so all of those things are going to depend on what your goals are. But if you don't have that plan, then like I said earlier, it's kind of a mess.
So walk through with me kind of in starting in a States 101 a little bit. We hear probate's bad, right? We hear in a state, we want to avoid probate.
Sure.
If we can avoid probate. So from your perspective, I could share my academic answer, but from your perspective, what is probate as a structure, as an institution? And let's kind of start with that. Like when someone goes through probate, what does that mean?
Sure. So people want to avoid probate because usually, the assets that end up in probate are the assets that you don't know where they're going to go.
Okay.
So if you have a probatable asset, you have an asset that isn't a payable on death, isn't a transfer on death. It's something that, hey, we don't know who the heirs are, so we have to go figure it out. Okay. And when assets enter probate, that opens up a claim period where somebody can go and make a claim against that asset, right? So, we have a farm, we don't know where it goes into probate, but I had a huge medical bill, so the hospital comes and says, we have all this debt and we want the farm sold to pay the debt. Oof. So, it gets rough.
That's sad.
Rough. It is sad. And, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a minute, but sometimes some of that happens for estate taxes too. So I like probate. Let's kind of go down the path a little more. Right?
Sure.
Yep.
So probate, public process, right? Everyone can see. You can go ahead and pull that.
Right, and that's another reason that people get nervous, because then, Johnny next door or Jane next door now knows what mom and dad's estate was worth, because they could go to the courthouse and they could see the list of assets that had to be
pretty much do it online today too. Right?
And do it online. Right?
Yeah. So it's pretty easy to find that out. So probate is that end of it. Now, if I have a will, though, doesn't that help instruct where things go through probate, or is it still open for challenges and chaos?
Well, sure. A will instruct where things go, and I should go back and say, in the state of Illinois specifically, if you have an estate over $100,000, it's subject to probate.
Got it.
So if you die intestate with an estate less than $100,000,
right,
then you have small estate affidavit. So anything over $100,000 is going to be probated. Now, if I have a will, right, that's going to direct where those assets go.
Sure.
Part of the problem could be in probate is if I don't have a will that's well-defined, or I've left an asset out because I didn't do my planning. So now I'm in probate with maybe this asset that's out there.
Well, and let me pivot on that.
Yeah.
So, the idea there would be, if I don't have a will, if I don't have a valid will, if there's people challenging wills,
contest my
all
will,
these things happen. And the wealthier we get, the more likely that outcome occurs.
Right.
But I guess the question would be, I don't have a will.
Sure.
I die. I leave property, land, cars, whatever it is, checking account proceeds, right? Mm-hmm. But there's no will. So this concept of intestate rolls in.
Right.
So I'm going to walk us through that, like kind of the worst case scenario, and then we'll fix it.
Right. So worst case scenario. So I have no will. We're per stirpes in the state of Illinois, which means we would go up to the next possible living relative and try and define the beneficiaries, right? So, maybe if you didn't have anything, would go up to your parents, would split out mom and dad, brother and sister, and it would kind of flow down. But if you die without anything or anybody, the state of Illinois gets to roll that into their next budget planning process.
So the idea there being, if we die intestate, we are going to go ahead and appoint somebody over the estate to try to find these people. But it's probably not going to be what you wanted to happen.
No, of course not.
Right?
I mean, that's the worst case scenario, and the only way to prevent that, which is where I think you wanted to go, right, is to put the plan. So you work hard your whole life for what you have, right? You save money, put money in your 401k, you buy property, you buy a house, and you accumulate assets. We just do. Everybody does. And then at the end of the day, it's that process says where those assets go. And if you don't do that, then it's kind of left up to the powers to be along the way.
So let's start with some simple solutions around that. Let's kind of start with something basic like titling, right?
Sure.
So how can I title property to make sure it goes where I want it to go? What about beneficiary designations?
So a couple different things. So title property, I mean, we think of three basic ways to title property. We think of joint tenancy, which has a right of survivorship. Mm-hmm. You often see married couples.
Yep.
Tenancy by the entirety, which you exclusively see in married couples, and that protects against things like medical debt, things of that nature. And then we have just tenants in common, which would be We own a piece
Like
of
if we're
property.
business partners.
Like we're business
we would have
partners or
that,
something like
right?
that, right? Now, your beneficiary designations.
Well, share a little bit about each
sorry.
title type.
Oh, sure, of course. So joint tenancy is probably what we see most because there's a right of survivorship. So the surviving wife or husband or whatever the marital situation is, they automatically have an interest in that property, of the decedent's interest in that property.
Got it.
Tenants in common, we just own a piece of property and
we both control our pieces.
We both control our pieces, and then something you could go and say, I'm going to give my piece to my child if something happens to me. And even though we're joint tenants on that property, I don't necessarily have control of it.
Got it.
Right? You went off and gave away your piece to somebody else, and now I have to do business.
You got to deal with that person.
Now I got to deal with that person, right?
Which is why we use a lot of buy-sell agreements and stuff in small business ownership, because often you don't want to deal with that person.
You don't want to deal with that person. And then you get into the idea that unless I had block A and block B, let's say, and that was delineated, we just had blocks A and B, then we've got to fight over, well, do you own A or B, or do you own a certain
So again, planning ahead of time.
Exactly.
And then if we own, and so that was kind of that joint tenancy. So sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, And then, so I think the
beneficiaries.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. And then, tenants by the entirety, which is exclusively for marital couples, and you see a lot of that to protect against medical debt.
Sure.
So beneficiary designation. So a lot of accounts are POD, the payable on death, transfer on death.
Yep.
That is insanely helpful because it's very simple, right? I have a 401k, I have life insurance, I have some sort of other annuity, and I say, this is payable to these 3 or 4 people in order.
Yep.
And you wouldn't believe the amount of people that they'll have multiple accounts with one organization, right? And they'll fill out one beneficiary designation form. And what happens is those other 3 accounts then have to be probated because they didn't identify those beneficiaries. Or people do it when they first get married, and or before they're married, and grandma dies, grandpa dies, a kid's born, life changes, and they don't update. And then all of a sudden you get a beneficiary designation form that lists 3 beneficiaries, and 3 of them were deceased.
Right.
Because it was never updated.
And what we run into, just to give some insurance context, is the world that I'm coming from here, is we run into that a lot with beneficiary designations, is that you'll have, okay, I've got an insurance policy, and I have someone deceased as a primary beneficiary, so it rolls to the contingent. There's no contingent, and all of a sudden, those proceeds wind up in probate.
Yep.
And what was going to be protected from creditors and got to skip, like passes from me to my kid, now winds up because I had named people from the past on there. You see that. Another one big that you see is on qualified plans, anything from 401k plans, 403b plans, and even IRAs. If we don't have living beneficiaries when we die, then we have sort of what's called an IRD asset occur, right? Income in respect to the decedent. So now something that would have been tax deferred and would have paid out over a period of time is suddenly, guess what? You owe tax on this.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And so you wind up, not only is the money now subject to creditors and public issue, now you lost this deferral that you would have had that would have gone another 10 years or so had someone else inherited it, or even infinitely if a spouse did. So in my world with beneficiary designations, it's one of those things from a financial planning standpoint, drives me absolutely batty. And then, someone will have kids. And I know this is a little offshoot, but I think it's relevant to talk about. We really don't want to name an 8-year-old the beneficiary of a life insurance policy, right? Because the insurance company just keeps it on their behalf until they get to a certain age.
Of course.
Usually in a cash style, very low yield account, right? But also just the standpoint of, if you did the before, if you did the guardianship and the trusts, and you did the wills and everything's coordinated, and something were to happen to those parents, now at least that money is being looked at by maybe an investment advisor that's trusted, an uncle or aunt that's trusted. And if you don't do any of it, you've got XYZ insurance company like, all right, well, when they turn 18, they're going to get a big old check.
Right.
Good luck, everybody.
Exactly.
So I don't know. This is my little rant, but you see that a lot in planning. And I would imagine in agriculture, you have the exact same issues, because I went and got an insurance policy 30 years ago. I haven't really updated it. It needs to be updated.
Well, I'm an offender. I mean, I have life insurance that has the estate of J.R. Glenn, which means That's going to go That's going to go straight to the state of Illinois.
Right.
I mean, so I'm an offender myself of what not to do. And it's interesting when you talked about not only identifying but also the tax issue. I mean, those beneficiaries aren't up to date, right?
Yep.
If they were up to date, then you could just roll that into an inherited IRA.
Yep.
You have your 7-year spend down period. You can manage your income, manage your taxes through a period of time.
Sure.
But if you don't do that, then it's your one lump sum hit. Uncle Sam takes its pound of flesh.
They do.
And somebody along the way could come and say, hey, part of that's mine.
It's bad news.
It's bad news.
So with that in mind, we've talked a little bit about titling a property. We've talked beneficiaries. We've talked a little bit about wills and probate. So we kind of hit the basics on the before end. Let's kind of get into this idea of, trusts on the before, right? Living trusts,
Sure.
right? Revocable living trusts, maybe ILETs a little bit. But when you work with farmers, with ag, we do see some trust planning.
Sure.
And I don't know if you want to walk through that. Now, this definitely, JR, is certainly not your attorney.
Yeah, I'm not your attorney.
I just want to be really
There's
clear.
no legal advice.
But we're
Very,
just getting very generic. But it is trust strategies are a way of working with probate and family legacy.
Sure. But to that point, I should put out the disclaimer. Yeah, by no means is legal advice being given. I'm not your attorney. College bases, FEFM. But so I'll talk high level. And so I will say that there are a number of tools, right, to do. So just you talked about living trusts. So revocable living trusts, irrevocable trusts. Some people have pour over wills. They have a revocable trust while they're alive with a pour over will. To just kind of manage some of those assets through, probate process and to protect things from probate. All of those are situational specific, again, based on what you want to do. You may be sitting, and I don't want to get ahead, but you may be sitting with a huge tax liability. So you say, hey, I want a generation skipping trust. Well, that's going to inform what one of those levers you pull. So if you think of your lawyer, and I think financial planner is the mechanics at a car garage, right?
Yeah.
You go in, you see the big toolboxes. Why are all the toolboxes there? Because there's a lot of tools depending on the situation. And I think people don't realize, or they think it's more simple. I've got a trust because my neighbor talked about a trust at FS, drinking coffee, so I got to get a trust. I get that a lot. And I say, but do you?
Right.
Your neighbor might be different. Your neighbor might have a disabled child that they have a trust for. Your neighbor might have an income tax issue that you don't have, or they may not have an income tax issue and you have I shouldn't say income, estate tax issue, right? They may have dependent children they're providing for. You may not. And so I think we hear some of those things and we're just rush, like, oh, they have it, so I need it, without taking that step back and doing the plan, sitting down with somebody and saying, what do I really need? What tool do I need to take out?
I think that's a great point. I think it reinforces not to jump into something, and where you have websites today and even AI tools, things like LegalZoom, and things where we can all right, I want to save some money. And one of the best presentations I've had the chance of giving, and our friends at Corteva brought me out to the Farm Progress show and actually gave this probably 6 times in a day in a tent. It was pretty cool. I enjoyed it. But the idea is estate planning costs money.
It does.
And estate planning with land costs even more money. And I'll tell you why. Land is very illiquid. And unlike a portfolio basket of stocks and bonds, if I need liquidity, I can take some of that basket, shave some off, and it doesn't really hurt my heirs, my legacy, my plan, my values, my goals, right? If I have an $8 million basket of stocks and bonds and I have 4 kids and I have to shave a little off to pay some tax, each kid still winds up with their basket, right? That didn't change. Land is fundamentally harder to work with because it is illiquid. We can't shave 4 acres off. That's not how that works, right? And so when we do estate planning with land, with farmers, and even with people that hold land that other people farm, you wind up in a situation where insurance is often used to provide liquidity at different life events, right? I need some kind of insurance in place so that as people pass, there is cash that I can use to do the things that normally I could carve out of a portfolio, right? So the point of that thesis statement gets back to the idea that you have estate planning costs because everybody's world is a little different. Sometimes you'll also have insurance costs, all right? And this is where estate planning gets to be not fun for people. is this idea that, what do you mean? I gotta pay $30,000 this year to pay an attorney and buy this insurance policy and pay these trusts and do the accounting on the trust. And next year I do $30,000 again, and next year $30,000 again. And you go, yeah. The alternative is that your grandkids won't have Christmas on that farm.
Right.
And you can take either choice, right? We can carve this up and sell it and pay taxes and pay debts and give the children that don't farm cash. And, we can do that. Or we can have whatever wills we need or trusts we need or insurance policies we need to generate liquidity to pay the things that are coming at death. And then that stays in the family. And I think that conversation can get really hard for people because no one likes writing those big checks. But sometimes writing those big checks gives you protection down the road. And I think that's kind of my thesis on estate plan. You see the same for small business owners that have illiquid businesses, right?
Sure.
Like illiquidity brings with it the need for insurance quite often. And then that can be expensive, And
I think there's two things, if I can piggyback off that. One of them, is, the plan you're talking about, like the business, the trust, the insurance. I'd even say, the incorporation of a business.
Incorporation costs too, yeah.
Yeah, but put the farm in a business, right? And what that looks like, and how do we run it that way?
But I think I would include that in the cost structure.
Okay, sure.
Right? That's going to be one of the things you're writing.
Right, but I'm just saying, one of the things you're writing a check for. But to your point, your salient point is that at some point, and maybe you don't want kids, you don't care if great-great-grandchild has Christmas on the farm anymore because you're like, whatever. Or maybe you do. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that goes back to that. Yeah. What are we actually going to do? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? And I don't, you'd see all the time people pass away and the family saying, well, now what do I do? I have this huge estate tax bill, or I have this. We have to sell that. And it's just like, man, if we would have taken a step back and laid out and thought, a number of years ago, a couple hundred acres wasn't a big deal.
I know, but now
at $500 an acre.
Right.
Now, depending on where you're at, maybe $20,000 an acre. You add some 401k.
Yep.
You have a pension on top of that. You put some farm machinery, and then you're over $4 million in the state of Illinois pretty quickly.
So I want to get to that, right?
All right, sorry.
No, this is perfect. So I want to pivot right into there. Okay. There's one more topic before we get to taxes, which I think a lot of people here are here for the taxes, which is weird. Like people showing up for taxes, but I will say, I know it's hard from just a retail financial planning client to get parents to sit down with adult children and have big conversations.
Right.
That's hard. Quite often the parents, for whatever reasons, are uncomfortable sharing about their wealth. They're uncomfortable sharing about the future. They don't even know where they want to go, right? So we can get the parents in the conversation, and then we wind up with kids in the conversation. And those conversations can be hard, but yet they're really critical in making things work, down the road. Mm-hmm. How do you get the farm family to the table?
It's a great question, and a question that's why it's the question, right?
It is
the question we struggle with. And I think there's a couple things, right? There is older generations don't want to give up control.
Sure.
And they're worried about giving up control.
Anywhere.
And that's anywhere. But I think that especially comes with, I've put blood, sweat, and tears into that 40
decades
and I skimped and didn't take vacations, and now it's paid for, and now it's mine, and I have a hard time relinquishing that.
Yes.
Right? And so I think that's one thing that particularly comes up. But how to get them to the table? It is the serious conversation of, if you don't, here's what happens. And I had that with my own family. I had that with my own father. My father was like, "Oh, we don't need to do that. We don't need to." I said, "Dad, look, here's the deal. If we don't, here is the best of the worst case scenario."
Okay.
And then he heard that. And I'm a practicing lawyer. I'm like, "Dad, we got to sit down. We got to do this." And he's like, we're okay. No, we don't need to worry about that. And I said, "Hold on. Let me draw out what happens." And he said, "Really?" And then he said, "Okay, what do we need to do?" And so I even face that as a practicing lawyer talking to my own father. And so I think that is getting people to the table is that tough conversation. And you'd be surprised the number of people that don't do it, and then they end up in a situation where they never planned, or they started a will and they never finished a will, or they could have done little things along the way to make it that much easier. If anything, they had 3 or 4 kids and they didn't say, "Hey, I want you to have that 40. I want you to have this 80." And now the kids are saying, "Well, I wanted that. Well, I grew up farming that with Dad." And now it's just
it turns into a nightmare.
It does. Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of add on just from a retail perspective. I had no idea anything about my parents' financial life until my mom passed away, and my dad realized, like, oh, I need to bring you and your sister in on this. Right? And it's not that he's particularly wealthy. It's just a matter of, like, as he's gotten in the 70s and 80s, we've needed to step up. And if we didn't know, we wouldn't have been able to, right? So, like, if we hadn't known any of it, we wouldn't be able to help the guy.
Well, and nobody wants to think about their own demise.
Well,
nobody wants to. That's another part. Nobody wants to sit down and really plan, because they don't want to sit down and have the conversation of, if something happens to me tomorrow,
right?
And think about
no one likes that
3-year-old child. What are you going to do? Right?
Well, and I would frame it more from a retirement perspective. I had the chance to talk to Christine Benz, who works at Morningstar Investment Research, and she just had a book that came out, and it's called How to Retire. And she makes this point in the book, and it's resounding with me in my 40s, but it's the point that she makes. She said, you will be your most capable and competent the first day you retire, as opposed to 10 and 20 and 30 years down the road. So make your decisions now.
Sure.
Make your decisions while you have your faculties and your health, because the healthy, smartest you, like, is going to make better decisions than 87-year-old you.
Right.
And that has just stuck with me, because I'm like, okay, so we should make a lot of these decisions when we're younger, and we can adapt them and change them as we go. But when we wait until we're 70 or 80, the decision-making process, it's harder for me to understand risks I face. It's harder for me to actually cognitively have a great bearing of what's going on. And if I can make those decisions earlier, her point in the book is, we can make decisions about housing and income that if we can make them at like 65, like, okay, I'm going to go buy an annuity with this $200,000 and I'll give myself $4,000 a month for the rest of my life. I can make that decision in my 60s. If I wait to my 80s to make it, it's not going to be as informed. But with land and farming, I think there's the same thing. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily, like, I have earned this through my blood, sweat, and tears, and maybe I have some doubts in my kids, as every parent does. But yet, the earlier we can make some of these decisions while we're as cognizant as we can be, I think the better off they're going to be.
Agreed. And so I'll piggyback quickly on that. I think part of that is we wait to make decisions because we don't think we have to. We're 40. We don't need to worry about that. Nothing's going to happen tomorrow until something does.
You're right.
And the other point that you made that I think is particularly salient that I want to hit on is estate planning, or especially when we get into agriculture. This is a living, breathing process. These aren't documents that are written, thrown in a safe, thrown in a lockbox, and not pulled out.
They have to change.
They grow. I mean, it's a hey, we pull it out, I don't know, depending on your situation, every year, every 6 months, however long or often you feel comfortable doing it. But you pull it out and you look and say, has there been a life event? Have we sold something? Do we do something different? Do we have a new grandchild we didn't have before? Do we have a new kid? Is there a new family member? Whatever it is. And those live and breathe. I mean, they live and breathe until the day they don't.
And I think that's one of the bigger issues that we see in financial planning, agriculture or not, is I have done all this work and I have put it in the lockbox and it is in the safe deposit box at the bank. And maybe I'm smart enough to tell my kid where the key to that box is. Maybe I'm not. Right? Looking through the top drawer, hoping for the best. But you do see quite often things like, all right, right now in life, like, let's take me right now in life. Married, 3 kids, right? Minor kids, 9, 7, and about to be 4. And that's where I'm at. Okay. Right. So right now in life, most of the things, right, go to Liz, right? Hope for the best. If life changes down the road, the kids get to be adults. What if one of us goes first? You have to keep adjusting the thing. Yeah. You can't just be like, oh, we're stuck in time forever. You're 9 years old. At some point, that kid's going to be 30 and very capable of inheriting money. Right? Especially if this financial planning thing worked out, right? Like, hopefully very helpful.
Exactly, if you did well.
But the living part of it is rough. And, you see people, a spouse will pass or they'll get divorced. And then you just kind of like, it's kind of last on the list. When someone dies, update your estate plan, right? Like, you're not really thinking about that during grief. You're not thinking about it during divorce. I better go update my estate plan, And then as your kids get older, you may not realize that basically what you have now in place works great for a 9-year-old, but really not so great for a 30-year-old. You know, so you see that, and I think
100%.
It's got to live. You got to update it, right? So there's a takeaway for everybody. Update those things.
Update those things, and no matter, even if you think you're on top of it, you're probably not. I mean,
so I hear you. So for our friends that have made it 30 minutes, which I think is pretty good banter. I think we're having a good time.
Yeah,
but
I think so.
I will say, like, let's get to the part they're here for. All right, there is a tax disparity with Illinois and the federal government of estate taxes.
Right.
It is a lot easier to hit either hurdle than it used to be. Let's walk through those. Let's walk through all that.
Right. So, okay. Just start to finish.
Start with Illinois.
Start to finish.
All right.
Start with Illinois. So, your estate tax is figured based on what is in your name that you own at DOD.
Okay.
So, you die 1159. At 1159 and 1 second, what was in your name? That is your estate. And I'll just kind of weave in and out here as we go.
Yep.
So why is that important? That's important because if we didn't do our plan, there might be a lot in that estate that is very costly, right? And if we planned appropriately, maybe we could have dwindled that down, whittled that down.
Given it while we're alive instead of waiting till we're dead.
Exactly, exactly, yeah. And give it away, right. And maybe made that a little bit better. So that is probably the most important thing. Well, not the most important, but a good consideration to have. So after we know what that inventory of stuff looks like, and that's personal property, that's interest in land, that's farm machinery if you're talking to a farmer, that's grain in field, that's value of grain in bin,
that's insurance policies,
insurance policies, yeah, that's prepaid expenses, that's a whole bunch of things.
Add that up.
Add that up, and that's what you are. So what you're worth. So in Illinois, the threshold is $4 million.
Okay.
And so once you hit that $4 million mark, then you have to start having a real conversation on, do you owe the state of Illinois tax on your estate?
And that $4 million is a lot easier to get to today with farmland prices than it's ever been.
And so back, and we talked about, I think I mentioned this earlier, back when, we bought a 40 and the basis was $800, or we paid $800 an acre, but now, because it's got a wind turbine in it or a wind turbine on it, or because just pure land values themselves, now it's worth $8,000 an acre. All of a sudden my portfolio grew exponentially and I really didn't do anything except farm it for the last 40 years.
Right.
And that's one of the problems that I think as I talk to, farmers, my parents, people that farm, live out in the country, people that farm around me through the work at FBFM is, you remember what you paid for it back in the day, you paid for it, and you say, gosh, I got a great steal, but you don't really sit down and look. The farmer next door is a multimillionaire.
Oh, all of them. Yeah.
All of them. And they weren't before.
Right.
And now they are. And anybody that knows the farmer next door, we don't act like multimillionaires.
No, because I think, cash flow wise,
right,
it's not that much different. It's not like your cash flow has gone up tenfold.
Right.
Exactly. The land value has gone up tenfold. Cash flow maybe hasn't, right? So we live in a way that we have traditionally lived, but yet the land that you're farming is now worth absolutely millions, and that gets to be the problem.
Right, and our grain's worth more, and our machinery's worth more.
Of course,
all of that. So, and you're right. So that gets to that $4 million threshold pretty quick. And then the thing that breaks my heart as a multi-generational farm kid is when families have to sit down and say, okay, do we need to sell something now to pay the estate tax?
What does that look like in Illinois? What kind of tax on over the $4 million?
It depends on how far you're over.
Okay.
It depends on how far.
It's graded?
It's graded,
okay.
Yeah. So it depends on how far. I mean, you're going to have a chunk. You've got a percentage chunk, and obviously you're going to pay more the more that you're over, right?
Okay.
And so, then if you start thinking about having to sell something to pay that, that's where you cringe a little bit,
yeah,
right?
You
cringe a little bit.
Right.
Now, you sell that, you're going to have a stepped up in basis because the basis
adjusts at death. Yeah.
Adjusts at death, so you won't have like a capital gain, but you still have to sell it. You have to pay tax on the income, and then you have to pay.
What kind of percentage are we looking at in Illinois?
For
what kind of rates on everything over the $4 million? Like 5%, 10%? Like how much of the state am I paying?
There is a calculator that you can put if you go to the Attorney General's website, and you can put it in, and it will estimate the actual amount that you owe.
Okay. All right. So it's as you have more and more, it becomes more significant to deal with, right? And I think that goes to this gap because when we think about estate tax traditionally, we're not thinking about the state. We're thinking about the U.S. government.
Right.
So the federal estate tax limit with portability is quite a bit higher than 4 million.
Yep, 13.9 million, I think, for 2025.
But that's per person, right?
Yeah,
if you use estate portability, you can
you
double
double
that.
it by 2.
So you can wind up 26 million and 4.
Right.
And I think that gap is the cause of a lot of heartache and misunderstanding. Because we often say federal estate tax limits have gone up, we still have portability, and with our current administration, odds are we'll probably renew our estate tax. We have no guarantee on that, but
because it is supposed to sunset.
It is supposed to sunset, and it goes back pretty bad, doesn't it?
It goes back pretty bad, adjusted for inflation. I think that's like 5 million or 6
So
million.
you're going to go from 26 down to 6. That's awesome.
Something like that. I have to look to be sure, but yeah.
With federal estate tax, I mean, you're pretty quickly in the 40% range on every dollar once you get to that mark of owing. So the problem I've run into with when you work in Illinois, you've got the state tax and you've got the federal, that's a big gap between the two numbers, but it's a gap farmers fall in.
Oh, 100%.
Almost consistently.
100%.
Right?
100%.
Because now this land under me may be worth $8 million. I want to keep it in the family. $8 million isn't anywhere near 26 or 13, but I still now owe on $4 million of that, I'm going to have to owe estate tax, maybe income tax, maybe other settlement costs too, require me to sell. I can't meet my goals.
Right.
Right. And so that kind of gets to this idea of adding up, which is the theme today. So I guess let's take a step back. So you have, this gets a little technical and nerdy, but let's go through it, right?
All right, sure.
You have a gross estate.
Yep.
And the gross estate, you're going to add everything up that you own or control or have an interest in.
Yep.
You get this gross estate number. It's not actually what you pay tax on, is it?
No.
No, what do we do? What adjustments can we make? Knock that down a little bit.
We're going to make we're going to have our gross estate, and there's a lot of adjustments you can make. But we're going to have our gross estate, right?
Okay.
And so, say we're a farming operation, we're going to have expenses, we're going to have cost of inventory, right? So cost of seed, cost of some of those things that we can adjust to try and get that down. So if I say I've got a crop in the field estimated this much bushel the acre as far as productivity, and I'm going to estimate this much bushel the acre as far as cost.
Okay.
And then I say, okay, well, or revenue, then I can offset that with a cost, right? So that's one thing.
That is one thing. Okay.
Another thing I can do is some of our creative state plans, right?
Yeah.
So if I own undivided half interest in things, then
there's a discount.
There's a discount.
Because I don't control it all.
Because I don't control
That's
it all.
True.
Same thing if we put farm into a business structure, like an LLC or something like that. We take discounts for transferability, marketability, all with our, accountant to make sure that we're, don't get audited, right?
I mean, legitimately though, if you don't control all of something, there is a discount there.
Right. Yeah. And so, those are discounts that, you can take as well. So, a lot of things when you start adding that up, you have to get appraisals on things, right?
Yeah.
And so, it's not as easy as saying, well, there's household good line item this. I mean, technically you should be getting appraisals on all of those items.
Well, and when you have farm machinery, the appraisal process is probably, and land and all the things, right? You're going to need appraisers to come in. And that I think is a big difference. That to me is a variation point from traditional family estate planning where things have a market value. Right, I can look in that Schwab account and I know what it was.
You know
worth,
exactly what it was worth at the time.
It is entirely different when you're on a farm.
Exactly.
Right, because you're dealing with a liquidity. You're also dealing with, what is, we're 3 months into the growing season. What's it worth?
What's it worth?
Right, like that.
What's the guarantee? Are we gonna get a crop or not?
Right. And I think so. All that requires the team, the specialization. So, okay, we have the team on the front end. You've got an attorney, an accountant. You've got your farm manager. You've got your children. If you want it or not, you should have some adult children in that room.
Exactly.
So we have that front end planning team. And on the back end, then we need an appraiser. Who else might come to that table?
We need our appraiser. If we have, depending on what kind of structure we have, if we have if we have a trust, we have a trustee, right, or the executor of the will, the executor of the estate, the attorney for sure, right, and we're going to need that accountant on the back end too, or financial planner, right. And I use those. I don't want to use those terms interchangeably because they're different, right? My financial planner is going to help me is probably the individual that's going to help me work through financial success, making the right investments along the way, and it's probably going to have my spreadsheet of what my net value or my gross value
but we don't appraise or do taxes.
You don't appraise or do taxes, right? But then, but then the accountant's going to come in and do that. So at the time, something happens, I'm probably looking to the financial planner to say, what are all the accounts? Where were they at?
Sure.
What did they have?
Yeah.
And then we're going to roll that into the accountant to say, help me file the 706 if I need to file estate tax returns. And are there any discounts that we can take?
What's what's that 6-month valuation date? Where can I value the estate day of death or 6 months after?
Day of death.
Walk through that?
Day of death. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to look at the day of death and I'm going to make the evaluation at the time.
All right. Okay. So with that in mind, we go through this process.
I mean, I have to file. Sorry, I have to file. I have to file within 6 months, right?
Right. So that's going to be what we do. When do we actually have to write a check to the state or the IRS if we owe that tax?
As soon as we file when we owe that tax. There's no penalty. There's no payment plan, so to speak.
Oh, so I can't just wait do a little bit each year?
Yeah, right.
Come on, man.
Yeah, there's which is the problem, right? Which is why, in that 6-month period, right?
Yeah.
I was just involved in a situation the other day. They're taking a second appraisal. Why are they taking a second appraisal? Because they think possibly at some point that land value may have shifted. And so before they decide may possibly have to sell or not sell that piece of property to pay the estate tax, they want to make sure they have a solid number, right?
Okay.
And so, because as that market has shifted, there may be a situation where they don't have to do that. And so, and the question of that in general is because at the end of the day, the government's not going to say, oh, we'll put you on a 6-month plan, right? When I file, the check has to go. So they want to be sure whether they have to pay or not, because if they do have to pay, they're going to have to sell quickly.
So one more kind of scenario you see, when you've got one or more children who want to farm and continue that, and you've got one or more children who've taken a different path with their careers, how does that resolve itself?
Say it one more time, sorry.
So you've got one or more children from a farm family that want to farm and want to stay in the community and be part of that. And then you've got a couple other children that chose professional careers, maybe more urban, right? Maybe they went out to Chicago, maybe they became, lawyers, accountants, financial planners, whatever it is, right? But how then do you reconcile the children that stayed and farmed and the children that have chosen different careers? There's no one answer, right?
There is no one answer. And a lot of people that do that a lot of different ways. At some point, maybe they'll write a document that allows the one on the farm to manage the farm, to take majority of the revenue farm, but they have some sort of off piece that they give every year to the other child. If you form something like an LLC, then the one child that you want on the farm maybe takes the bigger chunk of that, but the other children get to participate along the way as kind of like their own structured annuity, as it were, right? And some people basically, there's still some old worldness. Some people say, well, hey, the farm goes to the kid that stayed on the farm, and the cash goes to the kid that stayed in Chicago.
I've heard that.
So that's what we're doing, and that's how we draw the line. Because there's some primogeniture even in today that people want to do. They say, well, the oldest son was on the farm, and so he stays there, and it's going to the oldest son, and everybody else is going to divide up the annuities or the life insurance.
But I do think that, and having seen in my practice and even with some good friends, some complete sibling fallouts after mom and dad died.
Oh, 100%.
And they don't talk to each other anymore, right? And you see it like multiple times in my life. Do I know siblings that don't talk to each other? Because why? Mom and dad didn't bring them in the room for the estate plan conversation. And I think that is inevitably, if you're of the generation, you've got adult kids, hear me out. I've seen it. And my sister and I are not there. We actually have good conversation, communication about all that. But I do think that there's a reality that if you've got multiple children, not having clarity might drive wedges between those kids. And that's not what I think any parent sets out to do. No parent is ever like, I hope my children don't talk to each other anymore.
I hope they fight.
I hope they fight. I hope that they don't meet each other's children, right? No one ever says that, but it'll happen if you don't have those meetings.
It will. So there's actually 2 points on that I think worth commenting. One is, bring them into the room, have them understand, and have them agree.
Yeah.
So they understand what the plan is, and they know what the plan is. And if they have an objection, they can have it in the room when mom and dad are still alive, and then they can talk out so everybody's on the same page. The other thing that, again, there's no legal advice here. This is just opining. There's no financial advice. But one thing I think, an observation that most people that I've seen where this happens, right? And I think it's the worst thing that people can do is they just say, It's all one big bucket. You guys figure it out.
Oh, that's the
You
worst.
have to draw the lines
do.
beforehand. You have to get, and if you don't know how to do it, I've worked with some folks that are like, well, and it takes time. It takes time. It takes hours sometimes to sit down and say, okay, and I push back on, and people want to get the dollar value right. Well, if I give this to them and give that to her,
It's not going to be exactly
what's this
perfect.
look? But so-and-so has an emotional interest here,
Right.
but what if we give that to them? And it's not going to be perfect, but putting that time in
It is.
makes a successful outcome on the backside.
Because
just dividing the pot
Yeah.
after death, that's where siblings don't talk. That's where siblings end up in court in partition suits.
Yep.
And, who owns what? Well, I wanted that. Well, that was promised to me, and it gets ugly.
Well, and what I've seen.
And last one, sorry,
go ahead.
and last for long. So the last
Yeah.
one of those I saw was 15 years. So imagine litigating over 15 years.
There's nothing
The
left.
money spent.
There's nothing left.
There's nothing left.
One of the most contentious things I have seen happen multiple times in my career is when one sibling has to incur debt to pay the other sibling a piece
sure.
of house or property,
Right.
right? I've seen on that, so-and-so, I'm going to give them both a house, and one wants to sell and one doesn't, so one has to get a mortgage, and then there's just a hate diamond. There's no going back from that,
No.
right?
No.
So I find in my world, that's one of the things that we run into on a regular basis is like, when you say it's your problem, there's a good chance they're not going to like each other after that, right? And that, I think, that's something that we all want to avoid. I don't think any parent wants that.
No, but parents, and not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I think
Right.
parents, I am not a parent, but as parents, I think parents are naive in the fact that, the brother and sister, they've played together the whole life. They're always going to get along. Like, they'll do the right thing.
Yeah, $1 million drives that wedge pretty hard, doesn't it?
It does. And sometimes it's not the kids. Sometimes it's the spouse.
The spouse.
It's the spouse that's chirping in the ear of the kid that says, you're entitled to more. You're entitled to that, right?
True.
And when you share a house, when you share a bed with the spouse has got a lot to say, right? And so, at the end of the day, that usually happens. So.
It does. So I just want to share with everybody, we've got around 10, 12 minutes left. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the box. We'd love to go ahead and handle that. So there is one question, and then we'll have some closing remarks a little later. But one question that came in, if you have over a $4 million estate in Illinois, you do pay tax on every dollar after that,
Yeah.
So you're going to start paying a percentage tax, and it is going to be weighted. And of course, federal, the thing about federal income tax, to tie onto that, and thank you for that great question, is that in my career has been relatively short, right? I started in right around 1999, right? So I guess it's not that short.
I won't tell you what I was doing in 1999.
Yeah, it's fine. So I have seen in my career, $650,000 was the federal limit. I've seen it go to $5 million. I've seen it be zero. There's a magic year where it was zero. You didn't get your step up in basis, but you didn't pay any estate tax either. Now I've seen this new plan where we've gone to 13 to 26. So 600,000 to 26 million is a lot of variance in a plan.
Right.
And so when we talk about estate taxes and planning, I think to our point of not leaving it in the safe deposit box, as estate planning regimes change, old estate plans may be more or less successful than they would have been.
Oh, 100%. And it's a thing, just like, this is supposed to sunset, right? We're supposed to go back to a pre-level plus a little bit of inflation. Now, we can sit here and we can say under the current administration, the current, regime, we think that may not be a problem, and maybe it's even increased, or will increase. We don't know. But unless you pull it out and adjust it and look at it, you can end up in a big problem. So
I love it. So we have a question about taxable gifts coming in. So with regard to taxable gifts, if you could share a little bit about how much can I give each year?
Yeah, so $18,000 a year.
It was 19.
Well, 19. Sorry. It used to be 18.
Yeah.
They raised it this year to 19. That's another thing that changes. If you go back to the IRS website, it increases every year.
It does.
So this year's $19,000 a year. So $19,000 a year you can give tax-free. So I can give a gift. If the gift is under $19,000 a year, I fill out a gift tax return. I file the gift tax return, and there's no tax on that gift.
Right.
The problem is that counts towards your overall estate limit.
If I go over the 19.
If you go over the 19.
So what we often see again, is this idea of gift splitting and being as clever as we can with it,
Right,
right?
right.
So if I've taken a piece of property and I've somehow incorporated it, it's a little easier to transfer the shares than it actually is the title and the acreage, right?
Right.
So I can take those shares and I can say, well, let's value each share, and I can get up to that 19,000. I can go ahead and give kids the shares while I'm alive. If I'm
Right.
married, I can double up. It's called gift splitting. If the kid's married, then I can double up again, right?
Right.
Because I can do it for them and the spouse. And if they have kids, then I can give
You
to that, right?
Give to them per
So
person.
the idea is that one of the reasons we incorporate assets and because we want smaller pieces to work with, right? Is this idea of saying, okay, well, no, I can't give you like 1.8 acres. That's weird. But I can give you like
a percentage and give you a
percentage shares. And so we'll see that in any financial planning and affluent situation is we're going to try to start giving away pieces of that estate while we're alive.
Mm-hmm.
And it does two things. One, it shows us sort of the capability of the person getting the gift. Like, what are you going to do with it, right?
Right.
Like, you're 28, I just gave you and my spouse, we gave you $38,000 in equities and we put them in your account because it was tax-free, and we took those 38 from us and dumped the 38 there. Well, what did you do? Did you go sell and buy a car?
Yeah,
Or did you hold on to them?
Exactly.
Right? Or did you use some to toss in an IRA or something, right? So that's something to think about. I think that gift splitting goes a long way, but you do see more effective planning while we're alive, right? We can
100%.
still do things like that. And I think that's worth its weight. And also in the philanthropy space, we're seeing more and more today of Generation X donors giving while they're working and not waiting until later.
Right.
So we're saying, I'm going to give you 10,000 now. And traditionally it would be, I'm going to give you nothing now, and then you get a piece of my estate on the back end.
Right.
We're seeing more and more gifts now because I think we enjoy that moment of giving. So I just want to share that as well. And so I'm going to jump on, there's a few questions in, but I'm going to jump on something. So let's say one of the reasons that we want wills and trusts, let's say I own a piece of property in Indiana,
Right.
and I own a piece of property in Illinois,
Right.
and I own a piece of property in, just for giggles, we'll say Missouri. 3 pieces of property, right?
Sure.
I die. There's
Right.
no will.
There's no will.
What do I got to do?
Well,
I kind of know the answer, but go ahead.
yeah, we'll go ahead. Let's see your answer. Let's see how correct your answer is.
I mean, you got to do probate and estate.
Yeah, exactly. Right, 100%. And so, and I saw the question come in, and this gets into that kind of, these are why you talk to your advisors, because, at the end of the day, there are states that have certain formulations of LLCs and corporate entities that, like Illinois, couldn't go try and pull into Illinois, because let's face it, if you have a huge estate, and you have state tax in that state is going to make every opportunity and claim for that money as possible.
They are.
Right?
Of course they are, yeah.
And so, there is an interplay between state law and creation of entities, and creations of different types of estate planning processes and tools that lawyers are getting more creative with every day. There's certain states, there's a place where people go to set up an LLC in that state. Why? Because that LLC can't be drugged back into Illinois and other states. Right.
And you see the same with different trusts and different, it gets complicated.
It gets complicated.
And the point I want to make here is not to give any specific strategy, but my point is, if you own land in multiple states, trusts get really handy really fast, because now we don't necessarily have to probate all the states, or at least titling correctly. So I would encourage multi-state landowners, if you're listening to this and you don't have your estate plan ready to go, please, for Pete's sake, get it ready to go. And no, you're right. There's a comment about the entire amount is taxable and you have an exemption, and that's correct.
Right.
If I use up my exemption while I'm alive by over gifting, yes, that $4 million does get smaller. You're correct. So yeah, it is, we say $4 million, but it's actually an exemption amount of tax that equals what the tax on the $4 million would be. And so if I eat that up ahead of time, but in the event we're gifting large amounts while we're living, you could wind up having a greater estate play later. Right. That gift and tax exemption. So good point there. Thank you for bringing it up.
And we do that for a number of reasons too, right? As you said, we give people a starting ground to see maybe what they'll do with it, or we know that, hey, we want this certain thing to go to this person, so we're going to start that process now, so that solidifies that individual gets that one piece of property or that house or whatever it is that we're gifting away.
So there's a question about if leaving cash to someone, you should have an adjustment for inflation. Certainly I think that's part of the estate planning problem with life insurance, is that at the moment, I might look at life insurance for a number of different things. Right now in my life, it would be to make sure I'm the primary breadwinner, right? Mm-hmm. So it would be make sure that everyone there would make it until those kids are out of the house, right? Like that would be my goal for life insurance. So I'd use a survivor need. You might also use life insurance for a tax need. You might also use life insurance for a legacy need. I want to leave each of my kids $1 million, right? The easiest way to do that, we could make an argument. You could have, 4 trusts, whatever. Right. That's the old insurance sales that I'm talking, but
you'll have people signed up by then.
But the point of it is that you're right. The comment about leaving uninflated money is because we do tend to live in the moment, right? If right now in 2025 I say I'm going to leave each of my kids $1 million, that's a great amount of money for them to actually, if they never touched it, retire on, right? As if you had 40 years of growth. But is there a future inflation situation where I'm saying I'm going to leave my kids $1 million each and they're like, that's great, Dad, right? And there is an inflation world where that's not a lot anymore. What used to be 1 times your salary when people were on average making 40 or 50,000 and today we're making 100, 110,000, right? Inflation does matter in what we think we're going to leave someone.
Sure.
And the impact that has. And so I think to that end, there's something to be said for money growing and compounding and not necessarily just like planning on cash.
Oh, yeah.
But we do need to pull those out of the safe deposit box, friends, because what we think is good now isn't necessarily good later.
Exactly.
So I love that.
Exactly.
So we got about 5 minutes left. If there's any questions, now's your chance. And I do thank you for that correction on the estate the tax equivalency. All right, we have a specific question. I don't know if you want to answer this one because it does have some specificity in it, JR. But
yeah, I'm just going to let me read the question here a little bit. Let's see.
It's a technical question about a specific situation.
Yeah. So I'll speak in generality. So I want to go back and say again, right? The disclaimer here is none of this is legal advice. I'm not your attorney. ACES, Farm Doc, College of ACES is not propensing investment advice or legal advice today. But the question is about an LLC and the operation of a trust with an LLC. And I hinted to this earlier, and we've tried to keep this as kind of high level as possible to be more issue spotting than really get into details. I mean, because, if you have a 4.1, 4.2, 4.3 million, you're over. You're going to have to pay. Secretaries, the Attorney General's got a great calculator. You work with an accountant to go through that and to finalize what that number actually is. But on this, it's the interplay between an LLC and a trust, and some folks maybe in the LLC have trusts or don't. Again, there are multiple ways to layer and structure estate planning, and you do that for a variety of reasons. You do that, one, to make sure who you want to get the asset gets the asset, or maybe who wants to get the asset gets the asset. Oftentimes, you do that for liability protection as well while you're alive. You do it because of the estate tax issues, probably at the federal level, or possibly the state level, or probably at the state level and possibly the federal level, however you want to phrase that, and how much you want to provide going forward to future generations. So those are all questions, and depending on what you want to accomplish, you're pulling those tools out of that toolbox. Yep. Right. LLCs are great. Just for example, why? Because it's limited liability protection while you're alive. So that helps make sure that somebody doesn't sue you for something and takes the farm. It also helps when you start talking about discounting value and some of the discounts we talked about when we're evaluating whether you have an estate tax problem. LLCs, however, may not be the best course of action if you want to accomplish one of the other estate planning goals. So I think when we started this, we talked about you have to know your goals. What's important to you, what's important to your farm, what's important to your family. You figure out what those goals are. You work with your financial planner to see how you can accomplish those goals. And you also work with your attorney to say, this is what we have. This is our basket of goods of what we have. And this is our list. These are our list of goals, or this is our list of goals. And help us formulate and put the puzzle together, build the entity, build the framework to make sure those will go get accomplished. So I think that's
a great answer.
The key thing about that is, hey, does this work? Does this work? Does this work? You got to go back 100,000 foot and say, what are those goals?
Right.
And then how does that, do those goals change over time? And then what can we build to support those goals?
Well, JR, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a lot of fun. I can't wait. We have one more coming up. And with one more, we'll get a little more granular. And we'll probably go through an example or two.
Sure,
which will probably be meaty for our friends watching and tuning in. They can see us kind of walk through what happens in a few different scenarios.
Right,
and I think so. We'll get a little beefier on that. But thank you everyone for coming. This was a lot of fun. And JR, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.